Good evening, everybody. Welcome to my kitchen. It's late at night. My children are sleeping in the other room. Tonight we're going to try to cook bake a recipe, Eliza Leslie's chocolate cake from the 1847 edition of her cookbook. I'm using Joyce White's adaptation of this recipe, or interpretation really of this recipe, from her website. Joyce is a historical cook in Maryland. I'm making a few modifications myself. We're going to be looking at, how we're going to bake this, what is at the time a very modern recipe here in our kitchen, using techniques that are about as close to possible as she would have used. So I've got my ingredients assembled here. I've got 14 ounces of flour measured out. I've got my 10 eggs, although I'm a little concerned about the eggs because modern eggs are a little bit bigger than I think you would have found in a farmstead or at a market in the middle of the 19th century. I've got 3/4 of a pound of butter ready to go to be whipped up together. I've got a pound of sugar here. Now, in the adaptation of the recipe, this is one of the deviations I made. She calls for a pound of powdered sugar. And the original recipe calls for loaf sugar that's been powdered. And honestly, I really think what Eliza Leslie is talking about is something more like what the British have, but isn't sold too much here in the United States, called castor sugar, which is actually a little bit finer than regular granulated sugar, but not quite as fine as powdered sugar. Powdered sugar, of course, has non-binding agents in it, so it's not actually pure sugar and behaves a little bit differently. So I'm going to use this. It would have been achieved at the time of Eliza Leslie by taking a loaf sugar and actually grating it. So it probably would have been finer than this granulated sugar, but I think that we're going to find that it's going to melt in our cake anyway and ultimately probably not be that important. I wanted to avoid the thickening, though, of powdered sugar. Maybe that's a mistake. We'll find out. I have my 3 ounces of Dutch processed cocoa powder. Now, this was something that was really a product of the 19th century. The Dutch really started exploiting cocoa plantations around 1815 in present-day Ghana. The Ghanaian cocoa plantations are starting to churn out quite a bit, but what it is, of course, is the steam press that is able to press the cocoa solids out and extract the cocoa butter that leaves you with a cake of what we know today as Dutch processed cocoa powder in the 1830s invented by a man by the name of Van Houten. And so cocoa powder is one of those innovations that allows the cake to actually look chocolate rather than just having little bits of chocolate in it. Got some nutmeg and cinnamon. Now I'm using unsalted butter. The recipe calls for salted butter, and of course in Eliza Leslie's time all butter would have been salted. Today we have sweet cream butter that is the result of processes that we're didn't have in the middle of the 19th century. And of course, if you remember from the butter lesson, salt was an important preserving agent in it. So the next step is I'm going to take these 10 eggs and I'm going to separate them, and I'm going to have to beat them into a firm meringue or in stiff peak whites as well as stiff yolks, and then combine them. So that's what we're going to do next. So I've got my eggs separated out. You might be saying, 10 eggs, that's kind of a lot of eggs. And yeah, 10 eggs is a lot of eggs. You can always kind of identify an older cake recipe by the number of eggs that are in it. You don't have baking powder in this cake. Your eggs are your leavening agent. And one of the reasons why I'm not actually all that worried about the wetness of an extra volume of eggs is I'm really adding not so much wet to this recipe as leavening agent. The eggs are going to be what makes this cake rise. So I'm going to take my whisk, and instead of cheating and using my KitchenAid, I'm going to sit here and whisk away and get these egg yolks and egg whites, get these egg whites to a firm peak, and then whip up these egg yolks. So I guess I better get started now. Oh, hello there. Well, as you can see, the whisk thing didn't last really long. I You know, modern age and all that, and I don't really think Eliza Leslie just graded 85 exams when she had done this. And it's late, so we got to get this thing a move on. When she says beat those egg whites till they're stiff peak, what they're meaning is sort of the idea of stand alone, right? These are not, I'm not dumping them over my head like they like to do in cooking shows, but these are firm peak egg whites. Now I'm going to go and beat these egg yolks. I'm going to cream the sugar into the butter, and then we're going to start assembling the cake. So the mixer has really saved us a lot of time. I've got my creamed up butter and sugar. I've got my beaten up egg yolks. I've got my firm peak egg whites. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up this egg yolk together with egg whites. I tell you what, if I was going to deviate from this recipe just kind of based on what I know as a cook, I would have taken a little, maybe a spoonful of that sugar, and I would have beaten it into those egg yolks, because it has a tendency to make egg yolks you know, whip up and sort of be creamy and get more air in them. And I think that was kind of the idea here, but that is not what the instructions had said. So maybe if I make this cake another time, that's what I'll do. But I'm going to go ahead and combine these eggs together into one, you know, complete liquid, and then I'm going to go and put my spices and cocoa powder in with the flour. It doesn't really say to do that, but that's what I'm going to do. That's sort of like a modern baking thing where you blend your you know, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cocoa powder in with your flour as you put it in, alternating this, you know, aerated leavening agent with your flour to make your cake batter. So that's what's up next. All right. So I'm using a whisk to mix this egg together. One tip, if you don't bake a lot and you're making a meringue, probably the fastest way to make your meringue break and turn back into a liquid is to have some kind of fat on your mixer. So if I'd taken those beaters that recently had the sugar and the butter on them, they would have it would have started making this meringue dissolve back into liquid. It's a chemical reaction. It's what would happen. Now, this will start to break down when I mix it in here, but I'm going to be mixing in with the flour and everything and combining it together, so it'll be of a different structure. So as you can see, these are the egg yolks and the whites mixed together. I don't want to tip that over too much for the camera. I'll have it all over the counter. I'm going to go ahead and get my dry ingredients mixed together, and I'm going to start mixing this up in the bowl. So I'm just going to say this thing here is a pretty messy thing to mix up. One thing when you're mixing in meringue into like a cake batter like this, you want to make sure you don't mix it too hard, because you don't want to knock all the air out of it. Now, at the same time, you don't want to leave pockets of meringue, because what will happen is those parts of the cake will end up becoming like air pockets and they'll fall. So you definitely want to incorporate it, but you don't want to mix it too much, because what will happen is you'll end up with a flat cake that doesn't rise properly. Remember, that meringue is there to make your cake rise, and as it is. Now, this is a pretty sticky, gooey batter, very chocolatey. I'm going to grease and flour a bundt cake pan, and we're going to put this baby in the oven. All right, I've got my cake in the pan. I'm ready to go in the oven. Let's see if we can get this thing to bake. It's at 375 for about an hour. We'll see how it looks at that point. I'll put a cake tester in it just to make sure it's done. Smells good, looks good, so what could go wrong? All right, there you have it, folks. Eliza Leslie's chocolate cake from 1847. A little bit of breakage up here on the top where I tried to get it out of the pan, but I think that's because, as you can see, I got a little bit of that egg meringue not fully mixed in, and it stuck to the pan, but otherwise it came out very easily, just popped right out of the buttered pan. So this needs a little bit of icing, and looks like we'll try it in class tomorrow.